Welcome, everyone. I'm Carla Freeman. I'm director of the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS, and I have the great pleasure of introducing this discussion. The author meets his critics with Professor Amitai Etzioni of George Washington University, the author, and three of this country's top foreign policy experts, Drs. Dan Serwer, David Lampton, and Michael Green. The book under review here today is Foreign Policy, Thinking Outside the Box, and I expect a robust discussion of this provocative collection of essays by a figure who has made extraordinary contributions to the field of sociology and has linked his observations to thinking about both domestic and international policy with the goal of making the world a better place. We're really grateful to Dr. Etzioni and the Institute for Communitarian Studies at GW for joining us here at SAIS, and we warmly welcome friends from George Washington University who've joined us here today. We do have an action-packed program, and I want to get that started, but first, just a few points for housekeeping. First, I want to thank my colleagues Christine Kunkel and Prama Verma for their work, as well as the staff at George Washington University's Institute for Communitarian Studies for helping organize this event. I also want to let you know about another FPI event tomorrow. There's a flyer on the table outside, but it's on space policy and also looks at China's role in that issue. It's a new foreign policy study and policy. So I hope that you'll join us. It starts at 4:30 tomorrow in the NHTSA building at 1740 Massachusetts Avenue. Now let me describe how we'll proceed for the next 90 minutes or so, breaking at 1:45 promptly because Professor Lampton is off to teach then. But I'll start by very briefly introducing the speakers and then invite the author to give about 10 minutes or so of remarks about the book, and then invite each of the discussants to make 5 or 7 minutes or so of comments. And I think I'll start with Dan Serwer and then invite Professor Lampton to follow, and then we'll conclude with Mike Green, and then we'll return to Professor Etzioni, who will spend another 10 or 12 minutes making comments in response to the discussants. You all have copies of the presenters' bios, and these are all extremely distinguished individuals joining us today. And I'm going to have to be far too brief in introducing them, but let me just highlight a few points. Beginning with Professor Etzioni. He, of course, is a professor at George Washington University, and he directs the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies. He served as the president of the American Sociological Association and also the founding president of the International Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. And in 1990, he founded the Communitarian Network, which is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to shoring up the moral, social, and political foundations of society. And in conjunction with that, he also has edited the responsive community rights and responsibilities, that the organization's quarterly journal, and I subscribed to that in the 1990s and read it avidly. Dr. Etzioni's been called the guru of the communitarian movement. He's applied his thinking to both domestic and international issues in 24 books, of which I think today's discussion is on the latest. Maybe that's book number 25. Professor Lampton, this is not in particular order here, but Professor Lampton, my colleague here at SAIS, is director of the China program and also director of SAIS China, and he formerly served at SAIS as dean of faculty. Before that, he was the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the most significant non-governmental organization complementing bilateral state-to-state relations between the U.S. and China in growing the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. He has written numerous books. I'll just highlight the most recent, which is Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, but Professor Lampton has written seminal articles that I think inform all of our thinking about domestic and international politics in China. Professor Green is Professor Green is Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also a professor at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. And he previously served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 to 2005, first as Director for Asian Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and then as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. Before taking on that role and becoming a professor at Georgetown University, he was a professor here at SAIS and directed not only the Edmund Reischauer Center, but also the Foreign Policy Institute. So very honored to have him back here at SAIS today. And finally, Dan Serwer is professor and director of conflict management here at SAIS. And he, too, is the author of numerous books, including a recent one on foreign policy called Writing the Balance, which I commend to you. He was formerly president of the Centers of Innovation at the U.S. Institute, Vice President of the Centers of Innovation at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Vice President for Peace and Stability Operations at U.S. Institute of Peace, overseeing its peace-building work in Afghanistan, the Balkans, Iraq, and Sudan. And he also was the executive director of the Iraq Study Group. Before joining the USIP, he was a career diplomat and served in numerous leadership positions, including as American Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Bosnian Federation, mediating between the Croats and the Muslims, and negotiating the first agreement reached at the Dayton Peace Accords. He also served as Chargé d'Affaires in the U.S. Embassy in Rome. We have a distinguished panel here and a very distinguished author, and Dr. Etzioni, I invite you to begin our program. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for both bringing us together and for a very generous introduction. I'll be giving 10 minutes, so I'm going to rush on. But I do need to say first that for me, this is not simply an academic and an intellectual issue. I spent 2.5 years in combat in my formative years, from the time I was 17 and a half till I was 20, so I feel I know a little more about war than maybe some of my colleagues. And the reason I mention that is that when we stick to policies which don't work, they have a huge cost. I mean, since we, quote, liberated Iraq, at least 250,000 people have been killed. That's a lot of people. And then all the other ones, more, have been wounded and more who lost their homes. And they're not done. So when we're talking about these policies, we're not talking about rearranging pieces on a chessboard. Now, given, again, the shortness of time, bear with me because I'm going to use a very simplistic analog to make my main point. So let's assume you have a really bad infection and you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you antibiotics, and you come back after a few days and say, it's a little better, and the doctor says, well, take some more antibiotics, and you come back after a few days and say, well, it's worse, and they say, well, have you taken it every day? And he said, well, no, one Monday I forgot. Take another antibiotics, and this goes on for 50 years. You think that somebody is crazy. But that's our Cuba policy. So what we really talk about is the clash between theories we have in our head and reality. We have certain ideas how reality is supposed to work. And when it doesn't, we keep blaming reality. And that's the mental health definition of a breakdown. That's called reality testing. You're supposed to adjust the theory to reality and not hope that if you beat the reality often enough, it will adjust itself to the theory. But it's not a point we are getting. Now, if I go back to the doctor just for 1 second, he's not necessarily a bad person. That's what he was taught in medical school, that he believes in. He maybe gets his check from the drug companies. So there are all kind of motivations which are easy to find why people stick to failed policies. But the cost is immense. And therefore, I think our job as scholars, as intellectuals, as activists, is to see if we can jar them loose. So, given the time, I'm just going to take two examples of what I'm talking about. One is the Fukuyama story. So in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed and democracies were springing all over, this scholar who used to be in a famous place called Johns Hopkins wrote this essay and then a book in which he argued the end of history, everybody's going to be democratizing, and that's where we're going to end, because every human being, of course, wants to live in a liberal democracy. And even now that the Soviet Union saw the light, and we're going to jump from communism to liberal capitalist democracies. There's an underlying actually theory about human nature, that people go to democracy the way sunflowers go to the sun. That's their nature. Because oppressive regimes regulation prevented them, all they had to do is scrape away this regulation, and people will go to the light, somewhat the way Paul Wolfowitz assumed. When we're going to march into Iraq, they're going to greet us with a petal of flowers, and they're going to pay for the cost of democratizing. Fukuyama had another point which is not often mentioned, that there are some countries that haven't seen the light yet, that they are what he calls within history. In those we have to shove the middle to get where they're supposed to be. Well, that's what we did in Libya. So here what happened. First of all, the assumption was that it is a humanitarian intervention, that there is a genocide. I skip around the point that by any criteria of the United Nations, there was no genocide. That's a little aside. But originally the reason was to stop a humanitarian disaster. As the rebels marching from Benghazi to Tripoli, where Gaddafi was succeeded, Gaddafi suggested a ceasefire, a negotiation between him and the rebels. Probably would have led to a division of Libya, or I don't know what it would have led. At that point, we said, I'm sorry, we're not here just to prevent a genocide. We are on the Fukuyama mission. We want regime change. Gaddafi and his regime has to go. At that point, two things happened. First of all, we created this extremely unstable situation, which now creates loss of life, a new playground for terrorists, invasion of many people into Europe, which going to cause incredible difficulties in Europe. All this because we had a theory. We had a theory that we can march into a country like Libya, and that we can convert it into something like, the views differ. Some people turn into Switzerland, some people say only Romania, but somehow we could make it into in effect, many people say we just have stayed. Why did we not stay? Well, Libya is only the most recent example. Similar thing happened you know all the details. I just want to flag, it all comes back to the theory that we can engage in nation building long distance. That we, just one anecdote to move to my second example. We have problems with the school in some parts of Washington, D.C. You may have heard about that, I think, And so there's a corporation, a private corporation was retained to try to turn around the most failing schools in Washington, D.C., and it completely failed. And then we hired it to fix the schools in Afghanistan on the assumption that since we cannot do 5 blocks from here, we can do in a country with a completely different culture, completely different tradition, and so on. So we vastly exaggerate our capacity for long-distance social engineering, and it would be simply an intellectual failure if the human cost would not be so immense. Our greatest achievement in Afghanistan was to turn it from one of the most corrupt nations in the world to the most corrupt nation in the world. Basically, we built a highway which makes now the people who traffic in narcotics get their products quicker to the market. So these are two greatest achievements. in Afghanistan. Now, so that's one example of, instead of going back and asking, given our limited resources and our limited leverage, where we can do good, we vastly overreached, and we keep sticking to that policy and repeating it again and again. Actually, I should add one more example, of a, for me particularly sad one. When the conflict in Syria started, we said a precondition for negotiations is that Assad needs to go, because we didn't feel it was enough just to stop a civil war. We also wanted to have regime change. And it took us 4 years where we keep delaying and undermining negotiations under the condition that Assad has to go. Now we're kind of wavering on it. We still haven't given up officially. That, in my judgment, there are 1,000 reasons why Syria is in trouble. I'm not suggesting for a moment that our insistence on regime change is the only, but it surely is one of the causes why there is so much bloodshed in Syria. The second story is a little more complicated, and again, I'm not sure I can do it justice in the 4 minutes I've left, but let me try. So the European community decided to do something which I think is magnificent, and that is to create a community of nations. Basically, the way I see it, most of our problems are not limited to the national space. Pollution, climate, all these issues can no longer be managed on a state-by-state level, and we do need to move to a higher order of organization. And ideally, we would have some global community, but that's, everybody knows, it's a little far-fetched, even for our imaginary people. So to take a group of 28 nations as kind of an experiment, how you could do things on a regional basis rather than one nation at a time is a magnificent idea. The problem is that when you move decision-making from the national level to the next level, you also have to move your political identity and allegiance to the next level. Why? Because when you make policy which has consequences, there are winners and losers. When that happens within one community, because of our commitment to the community, people will put up with it. So again, one quick example. Once every 5 years, some reporter will write a story in the United States saying, you know, the southern states pay much less taxes than the northern states, and they get a much higher proportion of the federal expenditures. Unfair. And everybody said, well, they're all Americans. What's next? When the West Germans gave each year for 10 years $100 billion in marks to the East Germans, and they're Germans, so that's what you do for your family. If you ask them to do the same thing for Greece, they go berserk. And so we are willing to make sacrifice for a community. We are not willing to make them for strangers called foreign aid. Why is this important? The European community initially succeeded. Why? Because it did things which paid off more or less to everybody. More trade, coordination. I guess one quick example. The railroads in Germany used to be a different gauge than the railroads in France. So if you wanted to send something from Germany to France, you had to bring it to the border, unload it, and reload it on the French trains. And the European community succeeded to make all the trains have the same gauge. So they did a lot of that stuff, which was very useful, and people liked it. But then they got ambitious. They got interested in large-scale social engineering. And they created one currency. Well, one currency, not for all, but most of them, means you have now to have a shared economic policy, which imposes heavy costs on some countries and great gains on others. That can create a tension which you can deal with it only in a community. So people confuse this issue with democratization. It's not a question of political voting. The European Parliament is not a very successful parliament, and its relationship with the Commission is very complicated. But this has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happened in the United States after the Civil War. Up to the Civil War, the United States were basically two societies. The Supreme Court used to refer to the United States in plural in those days. The United States are. Only after 1870 we really became, well, that was the Civil War in many ways was all about. A union, making it one society. I don't recommend the war, but I'm telling you, Europeans didn't have the Civil War. or the equivalent of transferring loyalty and commitment. A very simple measurement was I talking about. A lot of people are willing to die for their nation. Nobody's willing to die for the European Union. It doesn't have that kind of compelling power. So the European Union faces two choices. And I've been writing like this since 1964, before there was one, when they start moving that direction. They either have to move to a higher level of integration, of really engaging in the equivalent of nation building on the European level, or they have to step down to a kind of administrative trade arrangement. They cannot have full movement of people, full immigration policies, policies involve major change without moving up the integration of into the community. So here's another example. The code name is Brussels. The people who really run the European Union has an idea of social engineering. It's based on the idea that you can have an administrative state without a community. It's not working and causing a lot of trouble. And they will be forced, prediction is not a good idea in social science, but I'll risk it today. They will either be forced to move up or down. They cannot stand between two steps. So these are two quick examples, there are a few more in the book, of what happens when you start with theory and you don't have reality testing and you don't modify your theory and you keep hitting it over the reality over the head, assuming that you are right, you have good motives, and therefore the reality should yield at huge human costs.
Thank you. Dan, why don't we turn to you?
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Professor Etzioni, for this really very readable and understandable book. It's really a model of precision and intelligibility. Professor Etzioni says what he means clearly and concisely, and he marshals the evidence with considerable skill and a great deal of erudition. I was pleased to be required to read this book. My doubts have mainly to do with the title. It advertises thinking outside the box, but much of the book, at least the chapters I was assigned to comment on, but I would regard as well inside the box, even if some of them might be described as new normal. Take, for example, the chapter on defining down sovereignty. A good deal of it is spent poo-pooing the Westphalian notion of sovereignty and arguing in favor of a more contemporary alternative, sovereignty as entailing rights as well as responsibilities. This leads naturally to responsibility to protect, which in my book is well within the box these days, and to another notion, I know not emphasized in the introduction, called responsibility to counter terrorism. And I thought this was an interesting outside-the-box idea that could be, I think, concisely stated as, if states fail or refuse to do what's needed to prevent their territory from being used for terrorist purposes, intervention might be justified. I think it's an interesting idea, which explains some current American behavior, in fact, but there's also an obvious slippery slope to unjustified intervention, a la George W. The chapter, and that is recognized well in the book, the chapter on spheres of influence is not so much outside the box as it is outside the realm of academic discussion, as Professor Etzioni himself documents very nicely. Spheres of influence are well-established practice in international affairs, even if the concept hasn't attracted a lot of scholarly attention. Professor Etzioni sees spheres of influence like Russia's near abroad, for example, or Iran's influence in Iraq, as providing space for rising regional powers and buffer zones that bolster a feeling of security. there's a problem with this notion. It discounts the will of those who actually live in those buffer states. That limitation is all too obvious in the case of Ukraine, where Russia has used force, and this is mentioned in the book, Russia has used force to prevent the Ukrainians from choosing their alignment with Europe. People just aren't always content to live in a buffer state, to live in a sphere of influence. They have their own purposes, and they rebel to assert them. The third chapter I was assigned to comment on has to do with self-determination. I would quibble with Professor Etzioni's characterization of Kurdistan as more democratic than the rest of Iraq. I think that's a stretch. But more importantly, it ignores the negative regional and internal political context for any independence movement by the Iraqi Kurds. It's not that the Iraqi Kurds don't have all the justification in the world for wanting independence. It's that the circumstances will not permit it, and those in Washington who are holding conferences on how it's about to happen, I think, are making a big mistake. It's not about to happen. They don't have the financial resources, they don't have the internal political cohesion, they don't have the positive attitude of their neighbors that would be required. Nevertheless, I would agree with Professor Etzioni's major conclusion in this chapter, which I think is very important, that decentralization, rather than secession, is likely to produce much more positive outcomes in democratic societies. He gives Spain as an example, where unfortunately the central government has been unwilling to concede a broad decentralization. That's a conclusion well inside the box, in my view, rather than outside it. One concluding thought which relates to Professor Etzioni's introductory remarks. He repeatedly doubts the applicability of liberal democratic notions outside the family of liberal democratic states. I confess, as an American, I feel condemned to believe in universal rights, as our founding documents are all too clear on this subject. So how do I square that circle? Because I sympathize with the view that you can't impose democracy on other countries by force. The way I square it is this. I have almost never met anybody, even in the most war-torn societies, who didn't want their liberal democratic rights. As a matter of simple practice, people want that. They want equal rights. Libya is a good example. I was in Libya twice after the revolution. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to go back because of what's happened since. But I can tell you that for the first year and a half, Libya was on a very good track. It went off that track because of failures of institution building. And that's where I would finish. We don't need to export the notion that all people are created equal. People have that sense on their own. We only need to help those people want to implement that idea to find ways of institutionalizing equal rights in ways that are appropriate to their particular national cultural context. That's a very difficult task, not one that you can do with the U.S. Army. And I agree with that entirely. All in all, Professor Etzioni, a good and interesting read, even if I think the novelty is a bit overblown.
A B minus.
No, much better than that, but only because you claim novelty, not because I require it.
Thank you so much, Dan, and now Mike.
Well, thank you, Carla, and thank all of you, and most of all, Dr. Etzioni, thank you for writing such a lively and important book, and I'll give content to what I mean by that. But I do want to say that the program was called Dr. Etzioni Meets His Critics, And I don't count myself a critic of Dr. Etzioni. And your early work in particular greatly influenced my own. So I wanted to say I'm not a critic. I may disagree with some ideas that are presented here, but it's within the framework of deep admiration for what you've done throughout your career. Also, when in your opening remarks, you said you had some practical experience with war. I think I understand exactly what you meant. Of course, my generation was Vietnam, and in its own way, it's very germane to all the issues you're talking about. I'm very worried that about a quarter of the U.S. population today wasn't even alive when the Cold War ended, much less the hot wars that preceded that. And in China, over half the population was not alive when President Carter normalized relations with China, and therefore has no memory of what the Cold War meant, much less the hot wars. And all the hot wars of the Cold War, I'll say major consequence, were in Asia, not in Europe, where we were most concerned. So I think and that leads to what I think is, with respect to the China-related parts that are throughout your book, I've been asked to comment on. I think your basic premise is correct, and that is we're on a spiral, a descending strategic spiral with China that is very dangerous. And therefore, the motivation of your book to say, what can we do about this? I'm 100% with you. So I think my value added isn't praising all of both the motivation, the purpose, and the legitimacy of the problem. It's really pointing to some of your recommendations, because this is a book, well, here's the problem, but what do we do about it? And some of the what do we do about it, I have some questions. I hope you can reassure me about that. Just one last prefatory remark. Out when we were getting some food, we talked about a crying need of American foreign policy, and that is to set some strategic priorities. Is China the biggest strategic problem we have? Or over what time frame? Maybe not now, maybe 20 years, who knows? Where does that fit with Russia? Where does that fit with ISIS? Where does it fit with a whole basket of transnational issues? And I think we need to have a national debate, which you, I thought, agreed and is implicit here. How important a problem is China compared to the national agenda we face? And if we don't have unlimited resources, how do we prioritize? And it's not enough, as our national strategy now says, we can't choose, we have to deal with them all. Well, can we deal with them all? And if we can't, then what do we do about that? So anyway, I think you really raise and address yourself to core issues. Now, there are sort of three things just that pertain particularly to the China thing that I wanted to call attention to and I suppose express some misgivings. You had a whole section, as already been mentioned, on bringing back spheres of influence. So I think that's one whole big idea here. And I think I have some reaction there. Secondly, you have a whole recommendation, no new commitments, particularly military commitments, in each other's buffer zone, I think is the way you put it. And thirdly, what we need is mutual assured restraint. And there are others that had ideas somewhat like that, including recently Lyle Goldstein and his spirals of cooperation and so forth. So I'd like to just say a few words on each of those ideas. Spheres of influence. I had a vague recollection when I saw this. I went back into Google. I had the recollection that President Ford said something about the Russian domination of Eastern Europe, and it seemed like he was implying there wasn't much the U.S. could do. It was a sphere of influence, recognize that. And the same issues come up with respect to Crimea and Ukraine, and some people say the solution is concede a Russian zone of a sphere of influence, or at least concern, and respect that. But of course, every politician in the American political tradition that says proposes conceding a sphere of influence to another major power, I mean, that's as close to a non-starter in American politics as I can think. And I'm very much, as you say, we can't continually ignore reality. I agree with that. But what happens when the reality argues against, I would say, spheres of influence or a non-starter in American foreign policy, whether I think they're a good idea or they're not a good idea? So that's sort of one thing. A second thing, as I think Dan brought up, and that is the people in the sphere of influence that would, quote, be conceded to either China or Russia. They may not, in fact, in the case of China's neighbors, they almost uniformly do not want to be in what would be understood as the consequence of either being a buffer zone or a sphere of influence. So you really, and you've got U.S. allies, you've got 5 alliances that are in reasonably what might be called a Chinese sphere of influence or buffer zone. And of course, we have actual legal commitments to the sovereignty and independence of these people in the zone. So I don't know how we do that. If we even articulated this policy, what we would see is a stampede of these nations to more what we would call bandwagoning, I suppose. And is in either the interest of the people in the buffer zone or the United States. So I think that's a kind of a bit of a problem. And then, I suppose, most of all, if we concede a sphere of influence, if it's ours to concede, what are the powers we're conceding to China? Because you're very concerned about how people behave within their boundaries. So what rights, privileges, powers are we willing to concede China to operate in Thailand, Burma, and so forth? And I don't think you'd ever get well, you wouldn't get any agreement of the parties there, and I don't think we'd find any consensus here. So beyond just saying the obvious, that is, China's really important and has big interests in these areas, and we have to respect them, and I do believe that. I think going any further in this direction, won't work, does not conform with reality, and would be highly damaging if we tried to do it. So that relates to the second idea, and no new commitments in each other's buffer zone, and I'll just take one example. Here, I think I know what you mean, and I can see why at one level it might be desirable, but again, I don't think it conforms with reality. Remember, the United States signed in August 1982 a communique with China that we would, over time, gradually reduce the quantity and not increase the quality of weapons we sold to Taiwan, which was a way of gradually, I mean, if it had been carried out literally, de-escalating our level commitment as technology moved up, because China was going to modernize its military, Taiwan would be frozen at some level, and it would become weaker and weaker. But of course, I think it's fair to say we really couldn't sustain that commitment in our own. And when China began to modernize its military and so on, we sold 150 F-16s to upgrade their military, and now I believe it's accurate to say we're involved in upgrading their naval capabilities on Taiwan and so forth. So as long as we have security commitments to people around the periphery of China, which we certainly do, and as long as China keeps upgrading its capabilities, if we were to say we're not going to, in effect, make new commitments within that zone of interest, we're essentially condemning them to obsolescence and increasing relatively weakened position. And I just think, at least certainly, you've got to go case by case, but Taiwan, we've been unwilling to do that, and I see no sign that we're going to throw our set of concerns with respect to Taiwan overboard. So that's a related but different concern. Then the last thing, and then I'll pass over to Mike Green, is this idea of mutual assured restraint. Once again, the problem's not with the idea, and I think it's a very sound concept, and as you mentioned, Osgood had talked about it before, and then more recently, it's an attractive idea that we don't have to reach agreements. We do something positive, tell the other guy he's got to respond, and then you get into a sort of staircase process downward towards more and more cooperation, less and less confrontation. I think that's attractive. But it seems to me the reality is, once again, my problem's with reality. And that is, we are headed towards, we're not headed towards, we're in a deterrence relationship with China now. And the basis of deterrence is really threat. And so I don't know how, in an environment of increasing deterrence and threat and worries about credibility and all those Cold War concepts, how do we get, practically speaking, towards a stair step of restraining, reassuring, cooperative process down? And wishing for it, I don't mean, obviously we all wish for it, but I just can't see how you move from an increasingly deterrence world into that world. So I'm with you on objective. I think you've identified the key problems, but I don't know, at least in those three cases, how we get from here to there.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I also enjoyed reading the book, and hope Professor Etzioni will sign it for me when we're done. But I'll let, you should reserve the right, or reserve that until you hear me. I not only taught here, I went to SAIS, and about the same time as my friend Carla. And when I came back from 2 years in Asia, I intended to do strategic studies. After the old ad drop period, you have about 2 weeks. After about 2 weeks, I decided that I would do Asian studies. And one of the main reasons was, like Professor Etzioni, I found a lot of the international relations theory highly mechanistic, based on very abstract models that very often ignored the historical, cultural, and geographic realities in particular regions of the world. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument that we should watch out for deterministic, mechanistic models of security policy or international relations theory. Let me focus on two dimensions of the book, China and democracy. First on China, I think the book really illuminates the dilemma that Mike talked about we have with China, which some people refer to as the Thucydides trap. The argument Thucydides made about Athens and Sparta, that the cause of the Peloponnesian Wars was the rise of Sparta and the jealousy it incited in Athens. And, oh, by the way, an authoritarian continental state rising against a democratic maritime state. So the parallels to the US and China are pretty robust. There's even an Athenian expedition to Sicily that looks like Iraq. So there's plenty of grist in the Thucydidean mill for people worried about the US-China relationship. And I think the passages on China illuminate that dilemma, and I don't think anyone has a simple solution to that problem. It's pretty complex. In my reading of the book, Professor Etzioni poses two paths to deal with this dilemma. The one is represented by Airsea Battle, which is a Air Force Navy concept on how to prevail in a war with China. And the other path is some form of spheres of influence. I think that that's the dilemma. One suggestion I would put forward is that if we choose binary paths in our strategy with China, in either direction, we will fail. It's much more complicated than that. There's a spectrum of choices in between, and we will, in order to manage this strategic challenge, we will have to simultaneously expand cooperation and reinforce deterrence. Very difficult and counterintuitive, but it would be a mistake, in my view, to choose one path or the other. Professor Etzioni primarily criticizes the Airsea Battle path, the choice of military outcomes. We recently, I directed a study for Congress reviewing the so-called pivot to Asia, or rebalance. Was a congressionally mandated review. And one of the things we argued was the point of our strategy in Asia should not be to win a war against China. The point of our strategy in Asia should be to maintain and win the peace. And very often military strategies, or even grand strategies that focus on military solutions, do, as Professor Etzioni warns, push our thinking in the direction of how do we prevail when deterrence fails. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other hand, as Mike said, if you don't have a deterrent element, and if you don't complicate China's choices, if you make it easier for China to determine that things can be resolved with force or coercion, you're in a much less safe world. So that's the sweet spot we have to find. Air-sea battle was never that sweet spot. Air-sea battle was a technology concept between the Air Force and the Navy, which basically involved finding ways for submarines and fighter jets to talk to each other, so that in a more difficult operating environment in the East and South China Seas with more Chinese ballistic missiles, we wouldn't have to send in aircraft carriers alone. We'd have more options. It was a way to try to find a way to maintain capabilities and deter and complicate Chinese planning in a region that was becoming more complicated for us militarily. It kind of died. It was replaced by other concepts. It was debated. The Marine Corps successfully trashed it. It's still being debated. It received international attention when the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments issued a paper on air-sea battle that made it look like it was a grand strategy, that our grand strategy in Asia is to defeat China in a war. So it's good to drive a stake in the heart of air-sea battle as a strategy. It's not. It's a technology concept to reinforce deterrence capabilities. But as I said, we've got to have those deterrent capabilities. And the other path, spheres of influence, I think I agree with Professor Serwer and Mike Lampton. It just won't work. Politically, it won't work. But in Asia, it posits a bipolar condominium or bipolar solution with China. And unlike some other regions of the world, Asia is a multipolar region. Japan is a powerful country. India is a powerful country. Korea is a powerful country. Australia is a powerful country. All of these countries could have nuclear weapons in a year if they chose to. They have ancient civilizational, geographic, geopolitical rivalries. The results would not be beneficial for anyone. The other problem with Asia is that even the one example of spheres of influence that people point to in the modern era that might have worked, although it's extremely controversial, Eastern Europe, was a case where the Soviets already had Eastern Europe, and it was basically making the most of a bad situation. When we're talking about the Western Pacific, China's claims are historical, but China's claims involve territory, waterways that have for the past 50 or 60 years been under the control of Japan, of Korea, and other states in the region. So China would be getting new stuff. That's pretty revisionist. It's pretty destabilizing, among other reasons, because what would it lead China to think comes next? And finally, it's a problem because it aggregates or it gives China a deal based on an assumption about the trajectory of Chinese power, which I think is very much up for question. We did surveys at CSIS about what regional order intellectuals in 10 Asian countries expected and wanted in Asia. None of them, interestingly, not even many Chinese, none of them wanted a Sino-centric system. Many preferred an American-led system or, if possible, an EU-style multilateralism. But very few scholars or experts expected that. When given the option of choosing something other than a US-led system or an EU-style multilateralism, which is far, far in the future for Asia, countries like India, Japan, and Korea chose a multipolar balance of power, that they would counterbalance China on their own. They wouldn't bandwagon, in fact. So that multipolar balances of power are much less stable than what we have now, which is the US as the most dominant pole in a multipolar system, with almost all the other poles, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, preferring US leadership to Chinese leadership. So it would be a mistake to assume that we're heading towards a world where China is the natural center of Asia in terms of geopolitical hegemony or leadership. Second, on democracy. So when I went to SAIS, 1985 to 87 for my master's, Robert Osgood was here, Bob Tucker. SAIS was the geopolitical center of neo-realist thinking. All of Hans Morgenthal's students from Chicago, the best ones, came here. And I was taught in Asian studies in the mid-'80s that Asian values are different, that Asians like authoritarian and communal forms of government, that Westerners don't understand this when we try to impose democracy. And I'm studying this from 85 to 87 and what's happening in Asia. The Philippines democratized, Taiwan democratizes, Korea democratizes. I agree with Professor Etzioni's criticism of the Middle East and the democratization assumptions about the Middle East, and I think with Professor Serwer as well. But Asia's a different story. It's a success story. It's evolutionary. I was the senior director for Asia, East Asia and South Asia in the NSC, when my friend and counterpart Elliot Abrams was in charge of the Middle East and democracy policy and designed a strategy called BAMINA, the broader Middle East North African strategy for encouraging democratization. And I went to Elliot and I said, look, Elliot, there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. 700 million of them are in my region, are in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I will support this policy if you let Asia do what it does on democracy, which is be evolutionary, with the US encouraging, pushing. And we decided we would ask the Pakistani ambassador if they wanted in. And the Pakistani ambassador, when he realized there wasn't a lot of money involved, said, no, thank you. So we kind of drew a line at the Duran line. And the reason was Asia's a different story. So the takeaway on democracy, I think, is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not just part of our political and cultural DNA. It's a success story and perhaps the most dynamic and important part of the region today. We've also surveyed elites across Asia about norms and values as Asia becomes the sort of geopolitical center of international affairs. Outside of China and Singapore, every country listed democracy, free and fair elections, good governance, women's empowerment, and human rights as top-level priorities for Asia as a region. That's the good news. The complicating part is we asked, what do you think about non-interference in internal affairs? You know, the principle that China espouses that we shouldn't tell countries how to organize their democracy. Korea, Japan, Australia, the advanced and developed industrial economies and democracies said that's just a bunch of old think. But India, Thailand, Indonesia, whose intellectuals ranked democracy and human rights as among the most important principles for the region, said, of course, you shouldn't tell us how to organize our affairs. So there is a caveat there. There is a cautionary tale even about Asia that we can't remodel countries. But I think we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So to conclude, I enjoyed reading the book. I had the sensation as I was reading it, and I realized what it was. And I hope you'll take this the right way. I was raised in the Unitarian Church. And when you go to a Unitarian service, the minister doesn't tell you what to believe. He just makes sure you think very hard about the consequences in practical terms and spiritual terms of how you live your life. So I read this as a good Unitarian and a guide, if not a blueprint.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of the discussants. I think, not surprisingly, we have Professor Etzioni have a very rich set of remarks to respond to. So,
Well,
invite
thank
you
you
to do
very
that.
much. First of all, it's been an immense pleasure for me to sign your book. My problem is that I got so many interesting challenges that I probably should spend my next 10 minutes apologizing to my colleagues for not being able to deal with all the issues they raised. So please forgive me, and I just try to deal with some of them. Let me start with the end, the easier ones for me. About the success of democratization, and surely I do not want to throw out any babies, however dirty the bathwater is. One has to be careful with these statements, because unlike the Fukuyama straight march of history, history is awfully crooked marches. And countries which were democracy yesterday, Venezuela, even Russia was more democratic, tend to slip back, including in Asia. So surely Thailand is not becoming more democratic.
Not right now.
Surely Philippines is not becoming more democratic. Indonesia has increasing Islamist influences. So I wouldn't celebrate completely yet. So it's a complicated story in all of them. But I don't think any part of the world is immune to the other tradition. As to the suggestion that human beings are naturally wanting liberal democracies. Every morning when I say my prayers, one more time in the evening, I repeat that thought until I come to Muslim countries. And there's nothing innate in Islam or in Muslim people which are antagonistic to this idea. But I collected all public opinion polls done in all Muslim countries for a study who actually has a very important conclusion for our policy. And it shows that the overwhelming majority reject violence, reject terrorism, but do not embrace liberal democracy. And the number one thing they rank highest is influence religion on their personal public life. The law of God is higher than the human law. Just to remind that our idea of separation of state and church is, of course, an American-French idea. There's been a lot of democracies, quite qualified democracies, who don't accept it either. But the reason that the distinction is very important is because we keep going to countries and looking for liberal Muslims to ally with, and there are many more what I call illiberal moderates. The majority of Muslims in the world are moderates in the sense rejecting violence, but they're not liberal. So if we're going to go out there and try to make an alliance of all the Muslim liberals, we're not only going to come awfully short, we will awfully short. That's what happened in Syria. I collected a lot of those quotes. We went to Syria looking for secular liberal forces, and we found all 5 of them. Then we spent $1 billion on each of them, training them, and then they got killed. So what you have on the other side is a majority. If you go to Sistani, think about Sistani as a symbol of this. There's a very influential Shia clergy, very influential, who regularly issue fatwas against this violence, but he wants a Shia-based regimes. So here comes exactly the test. What are we fighting for? Are we fighting for avoiding violence? Or are we fighting to bring people at the point of a bayonet and a missile? Regimes that do not want it. Now, that takes us to spheres of influence. And here I think a distinction which I did not make in the book, but I assure you it gets a whole chapter in the next one. And that we need to think about 2 different kinds of containment. And that they're essential for the question of spheres of influence and how to deal with China. And very much those on the distinction you made between 3 assets in your book and an issue I worked on before. Think about the world as having 3 layers. A coercive layer in which we use force, an economic layer in which we trade, invest, and a world of ideas in which we exchange ideas. You can have a total containment. You say anything the other person does. When the Soviet Union got landing rights in Bolivia, we went berserk. There was going penetration and so on and so on. When they invested in Ghana, we said we attempted every way to undermine it. And recently we tried to undermine the Asian Development Bank. That wasn't political. We asked them to invest more in development. They gave the other countries a majority vote in their bank. That is total containment. And that's what we are practicing in all these countries on the border. If we would limit containment to the use of force, we would allow the Chinese energy to go in economic and idea areas in which we should not hesitate to compete. They want to invest, let's invest. They want to give foreign aid, let's give more foreign aid. The countries will find out if their foreign aid has conditions which they find unappealing. If you go through Africa, they very quickly learn the Chinese investment foreign aids are much less desirable than they thought. So now let's go a little more in there. What happened with Russia? We had an idea that we want to get all the countries on the border of Russia to become liberal democracies. And the carrot was going to be they will be allowed to join the European Union as long as they change the regimes to our kind of making. That was known as the extension to the east. Russia said, we've realized that every country who joins the EU then became a member of NATO. We do not want NATO on our borders. We said FU, and we keep putting Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, trying to push them, not because they're bad people, but because they want them to be like us. We want to have all the beauties, everything Jefferson gave us, they should also have. that led us to support an extremely corrupt government, semi-fascist in Ukraine, and intervene in the internal affairs of their elections. It was leaked to the press that our state meet trying to decide who is going to be next. Ukraine, Russia reacted to that and explicitly stated to us, let the countries on our border follow their own light. We may influence them economically, we may influence them ideology, but we're not going to march in. They're starting marching in only when we decided to change the regimes in ways Russia finds troubling. Something similar has happened on the border of China. I don't think we should tolerate for 1 minute any military move by China into any countries on the border. So that's military containment. But if they want to invest, and if they want to send ideas into Burma, into Laos and such, we should not run around and try to prevent them. People say we're bullying. Now, that's a very interesting phrase. I don't have time to go into, but they may not give them the perfect economic terms. But the question comes back to this: are we going to block them in every possible way, or we allow them to play the same we do in all the countries? Invest, give foreign aid, give advice, and compete with them mano a mano on those levels, which in your book you make such a clear distinction on. By the way, the countries we support on the border, actually very similar to the Middle East. We supported a very authoritarian regime in Saudi and we helped in our fight in Yemen. We're supporting a very oppressive regime in Vietnam, all in terms of giving them liberty. We supporting, but I don't have time to go country by country. But it's not like we give them this beautiful life and protect them from Chinese influence. So that's all I have to say about the spheres of influence. By spheres of influence, I mean influence, not coercion. To say we should not concede, as two of you said, we don't own them. This is what used to be the question, who lost China? And the question, we never owned it. So the question is, we don't have anything to concede, other than conceding, then turning them into Libyas. That's what you're conceding. Let me see, there are so many good things to talk about. Oh my gosh, I wish we should have a seminar. Maybe we can get together to talk about the Kurds. I think the Kurds deserve everything possible. You're absolutely right. They're not ready for it. But give them a chance to grow. Sorry, about the mutually assured restraint. I did change my mind about that. I think that deserves an extra minute. And maybe I shouldn't take more time. Charles Osgood argued that the way to deal with the Soviet Union was to make small unilateral gestures, and they will respond, and then we'll keep ping-ponging this way, solving all the problems that way. I wrote a book at that time and had an endless conversation with him saying, you can do this mutual reduction of tension, the way President Kennedy did, about symbolic issues. When you come to the hardware, you cannot, we got to give up 1,000 missiles and say, hey, Russia, maybe you want to do the same. That one had to be negotiated the way President Reagan did with Gorbachev. So tension reduction and trust building, and that's where I differ with some of my colleagues who are willing to make major concessions and hope the other side will reciprocate. Symbolic gestures can work well to reduce tension and confidence, but then we need to sit down and negotiate the real stuff. And there where you get to the political issue you raised, and that is like this. Surely we cannot seem appeasing. And what I think now we need to think about is after we have tension reduction with China, and after we point out that really on most issues we really have no problem with them. On most issues we have very shared interest, that we need a grand bargain, and which we will say what's really important to you. And we'll say important to us is that you do twist the arm of North Korea. That's our number one priority. Not how many rocks you own in the South China Sea. Second, they will say it's important to us that you don't build a missile defense in South Korea because we never can be sure it's not aimed at our missiles. Then we say to them, you know what? If you're not worried about North Korea, then we don't need it. So if we would list what is most salient to us, and they would list what's most salient to them, I believe we can have a gun bargain precisely because on climate, on proliferation, on terrorism, on economic policy, there's so many areas in which our interests are complementary and not really conflicting. So containment should be limited to force. We should, tension reduction should lead to gun bargain. And I think it is logically possible, but that's just a theory.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Etzioni, and I really hope that we can continue this discussion in the Q&A. But now I want to open the conversation to all of you and invite you to ask questions and make very, very brief comments. But if you'd identify yourself and your affiliation, that would be perfect. And again, if you are going to make a comment, keep it very, very short. Thanks. So Prama's going to go around with a microphone. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Claudia Farris. I'm an independent researcher and writer. I don't hear anything about cyber warfare in this discussion. It's a new dynamic, and from what I see, our elections are being threatened by Soviet moves in this regime. I would be interested to hear what you have to say about how that affects or changes the conversation in any way.
Is there anybody in particular, or should I invite anyone here to comment? Professor Etzioni, do you have any thoughts? And then we'll turn to colleagues here.
I'm certainly not an expert in cybersecurity, but it's an interesting issue. Russia and China offered the United Nations a set of rules of how to conduct ourselves in space and in cyber. If you read it and you don't know who's written it, you think it was written by a State Department. We nevertheless reject it out of hand because there is one line in there which need to be changed and edited. So it is a typical area in which we go again with this confrontational approach, and in part because of domestic political needs, and in effect there is a lot of place for mutual discussion. And then given more time, we have to separate economic espionage and violation of intellectual property, which is one issue. The other is reconnaissance and surveillance, which all government do to everybody else. And the most serious one is kinetic, where you use cyber to damage the other person's system. These are actually 3 different areas, but all of them can be negotiated because, again, there are very similar concerns on both sides.
Thanks. Any of my colleagues here want to comment? Mike?
Sure. I'm not an expert on cyber, but I am an unwitting host of cyber visitors from Russia and China on a pretty regular basis, like a lot of people in this business. I suspect the same may be true for Mike and Carla. There are many dimensions to this, as Professor Etzioni said. Cyber exacerbates the Thucydidean trap, the security dilemma, some of the warnings that Professor Etzioni pointed to, because cyber attacks could have the ability to blind surveillance systems, satellites, and therefore affect nuclear strategy and nuclear deterrence. And in the Cold War, we had developed, after being scared to death by the Cuban Missile Crises, some basic understandings to avoid escalation. In cyber, we don't have those. Attribution is incredibly challenging. Who did this attack? Can we find out who did it? Often the cyber attacks, as I said, blind the other side, which leaves them facing a decision whether or not to escalate, counterattack. So there are all kinds of problems in the cyber world as a offensive, defensive, military game that we, the Chinese, the Russians, have not figured out. The Russians and Chinese are treating cyber right now as a kind of hybrid warfare, low intensity, non-kinetic way to mess with us, probe and test. But it has the potential to be an extremely dangerous weapon. And how we respond and how we control escalation is just beginning to come under debate. On the commercial side, it's a problem. I think it's a problem for China, ultimately. I mean, advanced technology firms are not doing what they thought they'd be doing in China because they're worried about theft of their intellectual property. Ultimately, this is going to hurt China more than us, because China's not going to move out of the so-called middle income trap from assembly and manufacturing to knowledge-intensive high-tech industries if people can't use the internet reliably. Not just access it, but use it without fear of intellectual property rights being stolen. For that reason, I think on the commercial side, we might find a way through this, but the deterrence military side of cyber, we're just beginning to grapple with.
Well, thank you very much. Another question here, this gentleman in the blue shirt.
So I don't need to, I mean, it's a small room, right? So my name's Elias Stahl. I'm a second year strat student. And I have two questions. One is for whoever wants to take it. It's about China. So you were comparing a lot of the kind of the relationship that we have with China now is one of mutual threat and containment.
Sorry, we're going to ask you to speak into the mic because we're recording
Oh,
this.
sure.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. So about China, one of threat and containment, that relationship. But at the same time, we also have, there are millions of students, Chinese and American, in each other's countries, incredible economic integration that we did not see with the Soviet Union. So I'm wondering which will prove more salient? How will one inform the other, and where will that go? And the second question is for Mr. Etzioni. You're talking about super communities over states, but this short century has seen a lot of failed states. So it seems like there's a lot of pressures that are exerting themselves on the nation-state structure, and we've seen a lot of failed states as a result. If it's hard enough to even maintain this kind of national identity, how can we talk about something more? And when we're looking at such a list of kind of these pressures exerting themselves on failed states in the Middle East and around the world, then how do you respond? What would your response be to any sort of organization, be it a state structure, a tribal structure, or a social structure in those regions absent of that? Thank you.
Thank you.
China expert.
On the first part of your question, first of all, I didn't say containment. I think in a particular way you mentioned zones of containment, but I certainly didn't, and I don't use the word containment. What I said was, or what I meant to say was deterrence. I think we are, unfortunately, from my point of view, in a substantially deterrent relation, which involves the use of threat to raise the threshold of cost to the other party so they will of their own free will decide not to engage in the activity you don't want them to engage in. And so I think, and I would agree though, the second part of your question is it's not exclusively a deterrence relationship. It has other dimensions, and you pointed to interdependence, really, whether it's financial interdependence, you mentioned students, back and forth, cultural exchange. Even in the strategic area, China and the United States have cooperated to various extents on Iran, North Korea, climate change, quite considerable, right? So, and I think Mike said the real trick is not to either just go with the logic of interdependence where you've got a conflictual issue, but not go the hard right to the, and I don't mean politically, I just mean the other direction, towards an entirely deterrence threat-based relationship. But how can we deter the most damaging behavior from our point of view or the outside world's point of view on the one hand, and preserve and hopefully enhance the zone of cooperation and interdependence? So I think we have a radically different problem with China in that regard than we had with the Soviet Union, because broadly speaking, it was pretty hard to find common interests with the Soviet Union. And so I think that really is the challenge, and we're in a different world. But then you ask, what's my worry? My worry, you can describe, we got to balance security and interdependence. But I believe human beings prioritize security. So if Chinese behavior, or from our point of view, or their point of view, American behavior becomes sufficiently threatening, then I think that spills over into the economic and cultural and all those other zones. So it's very important we manage that conflict so we don't trigger this, what I'd call the security primacy, because both systems are capable of going to a security dominant framework, right? And I'm very worried we're not as far as we might think or hope with respect to China in this regard. One very unfortunate incident in the South China Sea could change a lot of views in both countries. So the problem is to balance these. But how do you keep that balance, particularly when the security part of the equation is becoming more threatening, actually from both the perspectives of both countries? I think the reality is that both of our militaries are using each other as their big power planning conflict scenario.
David, can you take another second and explain to us the difference between deterrence and containment? Doesn't deterrence means you draw a line somewhere and say, we're not going to interfere in China, but if you cross that line, so can you just help us?
Well, what I meant is if you take the idea, I guess go back Kennan, and then there were sort of changes in what he had to say, but the basic idea was if we can stop further expansion, and I think he thought mostly in territorial terms, the Soviet Union, in the long run, by exposure to the outside world and its own internal processes, will collapse. And so what we have to do is limit it territorially until it falls under its own weight. And if we can, through peaceful evolution, cultural exchange, opening up the system, hasten that day, so much the better. So I think that was actually a scenario that was built on a strategy of regime change. Now, to me, if let's say the current problem is we don't want China to take Scarborough Shoals because it's close to Manila and all of this. So how do we deter them from doing that? That's a problem.
Okay.
And it doesn't speak to regime change or long-term projections of what's going to go on in China. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And just importantly, to piggyback on that, and it doesn't mean the U.S. has a national interest in harming China's relations with other countries.
Right.
And in fact, it is not U.S. policy, and I don't think you can find an example of it was, to deliberately threaten or countries that try to cooperate with China. The one example you gave, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, might be the exception, where China proposed this bank, and the Obama administration very clumsily tried to get countries to oppose it. And it was poorly handled. I think people in the administration would say that. But that was not strategy. That was bureaucratic politics. That was the Treasury Department not wanting to go to the U.S. Congress to get money, knowing they wouldn't get it. It was very tactically and bureaucratically handled, and it was a real on-side goal in the region for us. But in general, U.S. ambassadors in Indonesia or India are not given instructions to minimize Chinese influence. There's a game for influence of ideas and so forth, but the ambassadors in that part of the world, their instruction is try harder. And even Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, by U.S. design and public declaratory policy by Bush and Obama, is a building block towards a free trade area that includes China. So I think that's quite different from the Soviet Union, where we really did have a national interest in making in a zero-sum view of how the Soviets had relations with other countries for most of the Cold War.
I want to answer your second question, but just one line. Again, this kind very, very helpful discussion for me, because the way I sometimes see it is that we're going to Burma very much in order to pull them away from China. We suddenly discovered a country called Laos, which we haven't been terribly interested in, again, to pull it away from China. We returned to the military base in the Philippines, which doesn't make us very popular in the Philippines, in order to pull them away. We put enormous pressure on India to build up its military, well, I would use the word to contain China or to deter China. We unfortunately, particularly tragically, encouraging burden sharing with Japan, which means for them to build up the military, and that is pushing all the wrong buttons in China. I was a Jewish child in Nazi Germany, and I tell you, Germany really bit the bullet. They really decided never again, and they drilled into their schools and military the lesson. Japan hasn't even acknowledged yet what happened. There's no sign that they are. My favorite recommendation was that they should send some 200 Japanese to Germany to see how it's done. Now, so it's very easy to inflame anti-Chinese feelings in Japan. So it's a very risky escalator we are on. But I have bad news for you, and I'm sorry about it, but I feel duty bound to call them the way I see them. The world has become extremely ungovernable, and on every place. I mean, if you look at, United States, and we're not quite completely sure yet what's going to happen during the election, but I'll make you a prediction: whoever gets elected, she's not going to get a lot done, because we have polarization, we have obstructionism, and so we have a long list of overdue issues, and to which we keep adding issues, and we haven't resolved the other ones. Europe economic growth is stagnated. They don't begin to understand what it means for them to change. They are not immigration-used societies. And for them to come to terms with it is an extremely difficult process, and which will create enormous upheaval in the next 10 years. The Hungary, Poland, again, but we're talking about retreating from democracy. Poland is another example. Hungary never made it. But anywhere you look, you have, of course, the Middle East. We have not found ways, effective ways to govern. And now, one suggestion is to go back to laws levels, like to Scotland, and breaking Iraq into whatever, or redrawing the maps. That may solve some problems, but it doesn't take care of the next level problems, which are not, to repeat, are not territorially bound. Climate change, pollution, terrorism, human trafficking, these are all issues which disregard national borders. So our problem is the opposite, finding some effective ways to solve problems on a transnational level. And there, my only answer is, I'm sorry, it's not an answer, my only limited solution is, which David meant, we have to have priorities. Because when we try to take on everything, then it's not going to work. Before I leave that, if any of you have not read a book called Life in the Emerald City by the Washington Post reporter, it's a wonderful read. You can read it late at night on a flight. It's not at all demanding. It's full of anecdotes. But it shows you what happened when we try to go to a country and change everything, from a stock exchange to the traffic, to how much you smoke, to what the textbook is, and we end up by doing nothing.
Well, we have several questions. Would you still like to ask? Why don't I take the two questions here in the front first? You, the gentleman here, and then the gentleman in the front.
Thank you very much. I'm Nasir Hafiz, and I'm in South Asia Studies. I'm very excited to hear whatever has been said just now. It's quite coincidentally that in the morning I was thinking about a very important concept that I found quite answers in this speech. I'm thinking about the national interest, which drives the policy. It is taken a very simplistic view that it is a uniform policy, a uniform concept, but it is an aggregation of a whole lot of things. The political parties come in, the individuals come in, the organizations come in, then the services comes in. So many things comes in, and they try to represent whatever sense they want to make a national interest. So can you guide us that, what can be a formula or can be an aggregation, or what can be done about that the nations are not disillusioned by this word national interest? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And let's take this another question. And then, unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be our last set of questions.
I'm Alan Platt. I'm a SAIS grad. I want to pick up on something that Mike Green talked about, but the question will be open to the whole panel. I think he was right when he talked about America's response to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, that this was an example that stood out. Most people assume the TPP is not going to be approved this year. One of the arguments the administration is making, that it's critical that it be approved as a way of managing economic relations with China. If, in fact, TPP is not approved, and is China likely to become more aggressive in the economic area next year, regardless of who the president is? And if so, what kind of policies will we be following?
Well, thank you very much. Why don't so we have a question about national interests and a question about TPP. Professor Etzioni, do you want to start, or shall I invite colleagues here to?
No, let me go the other way.
Let me just do the TPP question. The odds are pretty much against passage in the lame duck session. The theory is members of Congress who have lost their seats, don't have anything to lose, so they'll vote for a controversial trade agreement. The problem is members of Congress who have lost don't have anything to lose, and they don't care anymore. And it's going to be very hard to get TPP through the lame duck session. And then both presidential candidates have said they oppose it, so it's hard to see how, the new president in the first year or two makes a full press to get it ratified, especially since either president's going to have the lowest popularity numbers since Andrew Johnson. On the other hand, the president has framed this. He's tried to make it a binary choice. If we don't pass TPP, China will write the rules. We probably won't pass TPP, and then China probably won't write the rules. That's not what China does. We'll have our economy is relatively strong. All the major economies in Asia are investing more in the U.S., not less. We'll have some time. The majority of Americans support free trade in polling. We'll have to find a way to reformulate and get back to this. What will happen in the near term, though, is diplomats from China will go around Southeast Asia, Korea, and say, see, we told you, the Americans aren't reliable. They put you through this grueling negotiation. They couldn't deliver their Congress. You think they're going to help you on the South China Sea? They think you're going to help you in the Senkakus in the East China Sea? They're talking tough, but you think they're going to be there for you? And that will have a corrosive effect on our credibility. It won't collapse it, but it'll be a corrosive, and the next president, if they care about Asia, is going to have to find ways to counter that. The easiest is kind of more military stuff. That's in my view necessary but not sufficient, and actually the wrong way to lead your Asia strategy at the beginning. So it's going to take some really clever strategic thinking. My sense is neither campaign is being clever about anything right now, so I'm not sure how it'll turn out.
I'd associate on the TPP with what Mike just said and add only that I think the real question is, China's going to continue to invest, build infrastructure in other countries, and this is a very rapidly growing area, and the question is the United States going to take advantage and get the economic opportunities out of that area? And do we decide to tie one hand behind our back, or don't we? So it's not so much how China's going to react, because I think China's going to continue pretty much doing what it's doing in the economic zone. And the question is, are we just going to pull out of a very promising area for our own national interests? So the other thing is, you ask, well, what would the rebalance was always rhetorically said to be a military leg, a diplomatic, cultural leg, and an economic leg. Well, the diplomatic educational's there, so. But if you knock out the economic leg, you're really left with the military leg. And is that the kind of posture you want in Asia, where you're leading with your military? I don't really think so. So enough on that. The question of national interest, very interesting. And this gets back to one of the major points Professor Etzioni made. He talked about, you said the mutual assured restraint holds that differences between the U.S. and China do not concern significant national or core interests. And this bears on, so Professor Etzioni is saying we ought to be able to manage this because there aren't that many really core conflicts. And then it gets to, I think partly in your question you had the beginning of an answer, and that is different groups within societies, and different societies don't always look at their national interests the way we think they should, or are all groups the same. And a perfect example of that is, I don't think it's about rocks in the South China Sea. For the United States, it's about credibility. Now, we know where credibility leads us when that becomes our interest, because it takes a unimportant interest, magnifies it, and we're willing to overinvest in something that we would say is interesting. But credibility is important as long as you have national interest. So I think these rocks, in a way, are about credibility, right? And that's how at least a portion of our apparatus defines our interest. For China, it's not about rocks either. It's about sovereignty, and sovereignty is about the revolution and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think the real interesting thing is how we can take what at one level we would say are minor, should be negotiable interests, and we elevate them to the point where they are core national interest. So unfortunately, I think we shouldn't have big core national interests at odds with each other. But in fact, I'm afraid we do.
Thank you. And Dan?
I was going to turn the conversation back to some previous things because I think a little bit of clarification is needed. I was very clear about talking about liberal democratic values focused on equal rights. Secularism is not a liberal democratic value in my view. There are liberal democratic societies like Italy with an established church, like Great Britain with an established church. There is no identity between liberal democracy and secularism. And I wouldn't try to sell secularism to anybody. I don't know anybody who's ever raised it with me, to tell you the truth. The second thing I'd say is that to view Russia's behavior in recent years almost exclusively through the lens of the U.S. somehow having provoked the Russians, I think is a profound error. I think Putin has made it very, very clear that he is leading an aggressive Russia trying to reestablish its traditional, historical, hegemonic sphere of influence. And I think we do have to see it in that lens. Well, whether we respond to it might be like the rocks. Do we really care about Abkhazia or South Ossetia? But I think it's very important to see Putin in a realistic light. He's an aggressive empire builder, not reacting to Western, to NATO or something like that.
Very briefly, if I may.
Yes, if I can just, well, this will be our concluding remark, so I give
Thank
you
you.
the floor.
About the TPP, I very much agree that it's unlikely to survive. I think that will give us an opportunity to next time not to try to exclude China. So that's a very good example of where I'm talking about there's a difference between deterring or containing them in the military area, but involving them in the economic area. Now, they may have well not accepted the invitation, or if they'd participated in negotiation, they may not have liked anything come out of it. But by explicitly excluding them, we again expanded that, what I would call containment, into an area in which it doesn't belong. It's also given more time. We would go through what we did in the International Monetary Fund, what we did in the World Bank, and how we delayed their acceptance to the WTO, to show that in each case where we asked them to become better citizens and more involved in international institutions, once they tried, we did everything to make it more painful for them. That's not a way to build an international order. I couldn't agree more with David that these are not, I call them rocks deliberately, because my job is to tell Americans you're silly, to make an issue out of that. That's my job. And I deflate this. But that's why I think the grand bargain comes in. I think Americans would accept if, for instance, China would be willing to defend North Korea's nuclear program. If in exchange we would say, the South China Sea, I don't know where that is, So, or, I mean, I'm simplifying. In a larger bargain, if we would agree to stop the daily reconnaissance flights up and down the China coast, which most Americans don't even know about, but drive the Chinese crazy, in return, they may even give us those islands. So, so that's on that one. You're absolutely right that secularism is not the essential of it. But religion, the Muslim religion, involves certain ideas about the role of women, the rights of women. Now, it's true we can go back that the Prophet didn't mean it that way, and that's the recent interpretation of Islam is not a kosher one. I'm sorry for mixing them. But those who say that they want the rule of God to take priority over the rule of people extend it well beyond secularism. I'm sorry I have no solution for the national interest, but I think it was well covered. So You know, allow me to close on one last line. My publisher will never publish another book of mine if I don't tell you, this is all in the book.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Etzioni, and thank you to colleagues and my friend Mike Green for joining us today and for such a stimulating discussion. I wish we could stay to continue it, but Mike needs to go to class, so.
Yes, this was very, very helpful. I appreciate it. I'm going to go to the. Thank you so much.